Hello everyone. In this episode I wanted to show you some of the things that I've learned recently digging into something called Filament, which is a new PBR real-time preview rendering engine that they've implemented in the latest beta version of DAZ Studio. I believe it made an appearance in DAZ Studio 4.12.2, and today 4.14 was released, which is the latest beta version, which has support for the RTX 30 series of cards. And so if you have one of those cards, then get yourself that beta and have a look. It has some other improvements. One of them is this Google Filament that was announced, I think, about a year ago for the first time in a log message. This is what that is. It's available on google.github.io/filament. And it says here, Filament is a real-time physically based renderer written in C++. It's mobile first, but also multi-platform. I'll share this link in the description of this video. There's an extensive documentation that you can have a look at that'll tell you a lot more about it. And of course, there's the GitHub project. So it's an open source rendering engine released under the Apache license. And that is what they've integrated into DAZ Studio now. Here's some examples of what the engine can do. It works on all the major platforms, including mobile, and it has everything that we really need: reflections and transparency, and it's got bump maps, and most importantly, of course, it's real time. So no more approximated texture shaded, kind of almost there, but really, really far away from reality type previews. And, there's also subsurface scattering. Hey, I know that guy. Good friend of mine, Suzanne, I don't know. So Google are using it in their AR maps, I guess, and you can also put sharks in living rooms, which is seriously important. Anyway, what it looks like in DAZ Studio is what we're going to have a look at in a moment, and how to get started, because it's not quite easy to get the most out of it. And it's also probably important to remember what it's actually there for. It's not there to replace the Iray engine. It is more there to give you a better idea of what your Iray rendered image is going to look like while you're working with it. But of course, it's not as easy as clicking a button and everything works. That would be awesome. It's never like that in 3D, is it? I've got some example renders here for you. This is one I've rendered in Filament, and it's not bad. So I had to make some tweaks to make that happen. We can zoom in a moment. I just wanted to give you a little breakdown of this is Filament, and this is in fact the multi-OpenGL option. So there's a big improvements there, because you can see the bump map. So this is completely flat. There's some things are not working great if you compare that to an Iray render, like the hair, for example. If we were to go, zoom in at the top here, so it does do transparency, it just doesn't do it very well in this current implementation. But compared to OpenGL, or the simple version of OpenGL, which is what this is, Filament is certainly a step in the right direction. If you zoom in more closely, you can see that there's actually, don't know if you can see that on the video, there's actually detail on the skin. So that's quite exciting in Filament. And there's also bump maps here on the uniform. We'll have a look at this in two scenes. One of them is going to be with an outdoor scene with Stonemason's Urban Sprawl 3, and the other one is with a character. So we'll have a look at those things. It is just to finish this off, this is a kind of a bad Iray render to have that side by side there, but so there's a big difference there still. So the transparency in the hair is one thing that we have in Iray. We have good transparency here, even in my bad version of this render. So that is something that can probably be improved. And there's also transparency in the glasses. If you look at this is actually, it does have reflections here in Filament. But if I compare that to Iray, there's a lot more going on in Iray in regards to how the light bends through the glass. So we have these little shadows underneath here. Got a reflection here, that's better. And of course, we have a little bit of a dimmed down version of the glass. So there's some refraction going on there. But all in all, I think it's a great step in the right direction. Let me give you a little real-time preview in DAZ Studio. This is it. This is a scene I have prepared earlier. I will tell you how to set this up and how to tweak the light. I'll give myself a little bit more room here and just go switch this. This is my camera with which we can play around in a minute. I'm going to go and switch this to my perspective view and hopefully go wander around the set a little bit. It's a little bit far out, but yeah, performance is nice. I have a feeling it's a little bit better than OpenGL. So it looks like even with this extremely heavy set here, it gives me, once I'm actually in there we go, we can go and move around like this was a first-person computer game now. I really like that. And I don't think I can get quite 30 frames a second, but I certainly get more frames a second than I did with OpenGL, I find. See if I can find some interesting shops that we can have a look at here. Office supply, stationery. Oh, that's nice. They have Olympic deals. Good stuff. And what we got here? Oh, this is good. But cut price liquors, 75% off. We should go there. This is great. So if I compare this to the OpenGL, so yeah, the first thing you'll notice is that I do have my HDRI showing in the background already. It's the same one that is supplied with the default DAZ scene, and it does have an effect in Filament, which is nice, compared to the texture shaded option, which does not have that. It takes a moment to switch out these two things, which does not have that. And of course there's a lot of it's just an approximation of what the lighting is going to be like. So with Filament, the great thing is that we see the same effect of the HDRI that our Iray engine would have. So I think the current release version of DAZ Studio has a bit of an issue with OpenGL. As you move your viewport, you might feel that there's a lot of lag, and with the beta that lag seems to be gone both in OpenGL and in Filament. So in case you do experience some viewport issues, grab yourself that latest beta. This is the one that I have just for completion here. This is it, DAZ Studio 4.14.0.8 Pro Edition. Awesome stuff. Yeah, new little picture here that we have. So I'll switch this back to Filament and show you a couple of things that lets us get started, so that the lights kind of looks similar to what we get with OpenGL or Iray, because that doesn't happen out of the box, sadly. So yeah, that's what this video is all about. Let me go and remove everything that I've got in here. This is just the scene here. All these 5 blocks, that's the scene. I could just go and put that into a little group, I guess, couldn't I? Let me go and do that. Create a group, and I'll just call that group, and that will just condense that down. I have my camera in here, so this, I think, might just call that one my urban sprawl. Is that how you spell it? No. Sprawl, there we go, that's how you spell it. My camera's in here. I've got this thing which is called a Filament Draw Options node, and I've got 2 other things that DAZ Studio has kind of smuggled in here for me. I didn't really put those in. We can take those out, and I'll show you what happens the moment we switch this over to Iray. These 2 things will come back, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But yeah, Filament Draw Options is also not in here by default, so I'm going to go delete that as well, and that will now make our scene look like this, which is very blown out and very bright. So we'll see how that works. So right now I'm thinking, well, if I look at this compared to my texture shaded view, that's such a significant difference that I'm thinking, well, that's not even the same. So what's going on here? So I suppose what will have to happen under the hood is that the Filament render engine will look at the existing surface descriptions of our object and makes a translation based on what the Filament render engine needs under the hood. And this happens without our involvement. It does this automatically, so it grabs the maps and just basically talks to a different render engine under the hood. So that translation process is difficult. But there's that, but there's also the way lights are translated. While we don't have an influence on how surfaces are translated, we do have a little bit of an option to play with how lights are translated. So right now I don't have any lights in my scene. All I have in my scene is the regular DAZ Studio default small resolution ruins image there. By the way, if I go and switch this over while we're talking about this, if I go switch this over to NVIDIA Iray, watch what happens to my viewport. That will magically go and give me these 2 nodes back that I saw there a moment ago. Give DAZ Studio a moment to crank this thing up, just so that we can see a side-by-side comparison. There we go. tone mapper options and environment options. So while DAZ Studio is kind of cooking things in the background, these two things, I think they're not quite ready. They're not quite finished with the integration yet. If I head over to my render settings now, you can see that the environment options and the tone mapper options, if I select them up here, they are now essentially the same options that we could and still can access in the render settings tab under tone mapping and environment. These have been kind of split out or made available in addition to what we already have on the parameters tab now. So as soon as you switch your viewport over to Iray, these two nodes will appear. And if you head over to the parameters tab with any of these selected, you can now adjust most of these options in there. So I don't know if they're going to disappear from the render settings tab, or if they're going to go and switch them over, or if they're going to leave them there in multiple things here. I don't know. So environment options, there it is. That's now also available under environment options, and this is where I see my HDR image. And it's the same that is happening under the render settings tab in environment. But if I now remove this node, then this environment tab is also going to go away, interestingly. It's one of those things, I don't know what they're planning. You never really know what DAZ are planning. I'm sure it all makes sense. I'm kind of a fan of it because tone mapping is not technically part of the rendering process. It is technically a post process. Maybe it's so that we can access the properties better. I don't really know. I'm telling you all this because this hooks in with the other thing that we need to make Filament look great in our viewport, and that is happening under the Create tab up here. Actually, can you see that at the very bottom here? There's these things that I can create. New Filament Draw Options node, and that's a very important one. So we also have the environment and tone mapper options, so we can create them if they're not there, if we wanted to do that, but they are. The moment you switch your Iray viewport on, these two are being added automatically. Don't know, maybe that's going to happen when we switch on the filament draw options at one point, but for now we have to create them manually. So let's go create them, and that just leave the default options, hit accept, and that gives us another thing in here. I don't really want to deal, to be really honest, with the tone mapper and environment options. So I think I'm going to go and drag those into my urban sprawl set just so that they're out of our way, because this is the one that we really want to focus on. So let's select it and head over to our parameters tab and then select all our options and gander at what's available here. So we have optimization, which I'll show you later. Tone mapping, this is also an interesting one. We're going to look at that. And then we have environment. This is where the really interesting things are happening. There's two sections. The bottom one, I really don't know what that's all about, but there's the top one, which is scale, and that's the one we really want to have a look at. It lets us tweak how the lights that are currently in the scene are being converted for use with filament. So right now I don't have any scene lights, I don't have any distance lights. So scene lights is point lights, spotlights. Distance lights are basically the distant light, and the environment intensity scale, that is to change the intensity of the environment. And right now, with really nothing tweaked, this is Iray. I'll go and switch this to my camera. Here's what it looks like. And if I now go and switch my viewport over to Filament, watch what happens. The look and feel of the scene is completely going to change. Things are going to look a lot more blown out, and actually DAZ Studio has crashed. That's what happened. That's not so good, is it? So I'm going to have to go and start this again. Also, look at this. Is what I love this. The submit button is actually grayed out, so they don't really want us to submit a bug. Crazy stuff. Give me a minute while I go and not submit that. And we're back. As I was saying a moment ago, what you'll see now is that the Filament viewport looks extremely blown out. So not at all like what our Iray scene used to look like. And that is because the environment light is being translated at probably the wrong scale. I don't really know why we have default values like that. So the current one is, let's have a look, it is 15,000. That's probably a little bit too high. So if we tone that down to say 2,000, watch what happens with my scene. So it looks a lot closer to what the Iray version used to look like. The scene lights and distance lights, they don't have any effect on my scene because I don't have such lights in here. So I'll go and reset that. But we'll see my character example in a minute, how that'll affect your scene. So this makes a change, but there's something else that'll make a change. That's under tone mapping. That's the ISO scale. That's currently set to 1. And watch what happens if I fiddle with that. So that's a much more subtle change as my scene goes darker or lighter. So this is essentially like, from what I can tell, it's a bit like a gamma adjustment. If you want your scene, if you want your gamma curve to go a little bit higher or lower, it doesn't give contrast to the image. It's about exposure, I have a feeling. So those two things you can use in conjunction. I'm going to leave mine on 1 for now. And, you know, this is something you can compare to the Iray viewport and basically make adjustments to see what works best. And then you can go ahead and start working with your scene in Filament and position your objects, and you'll see a much better preview as to what your Iray image is going to look like later. Currently, if I head over to my render settings, this hasn't really changed. Over here at the top, I can pick the engine. That's either Iray or 3Delight or scripted 3Delight, but we can currently not natively render with Filament because I don't think that's what it's meant for. But we can utilize it if you find, hey, the quality of Filament is good enough for what I'm doing. You can go ahead over here, and then instead of Iray, you can go and say render whatever the viewport currently has. And under general, you will still have your size options and all that, so you can crank that up to a much higher resolution. And then you can hit render, and that'll render out your image in that resolution. So if I go and, just as an example, if I go and put that to 1920 by 1080, that will have an effect on my viewport, of course. Let's go and show my aspect ratio. If I'm happy with, you know, if I wanted to render, I don't know, this, maybe I can go and set the engine to viewport, and then let me just go and show you how quickly that actually renders. Hit render, and that's it. Boom. That's rendered. And you can do that with much higher resolutions as well. Just make sure you don't occlude the viewport, because it does actually use your viewport for that thing. So if I could just go and, you know, do that on 3080/40 by 2160, let's do that render, and seconds later we're presented with boom, picture. Awesome. So it only takes a few seconds, and that is how that works. Go save it to your heart's content. If that is enough for you, then you can render with Filament that way. Excellent. Let's have a look at the other options next with a character. My lovely assistant Jolina will help me out to demonstrate these. Hello, Jolina. Creation by Fred Winkler, by the way. Very nice. Good work, Fred. Absolutely awesome. Awesome job chiseling away at ZBrush, I guess. So this is the texture shaded viewport. And currently I don't really have anything other than her and some clothing in the scene. I've deliberately given her no hair because, you know, hair takes a little bit longer to render. Let's go switch this from texture shaded to Iray. There's no scene lights or anything, just the default environment light again. And once again, if I switch this over, I go and see my tone mapper options here. Just like before, because I don't really want to deal with these options, I'm going to go and put them under Jolina just so that they're out of the way. There, that's that. I might also just create myself a camera while I'm here. That will frame up what I'm currently seeing in the perspective view. And I'm doing that so that we have a nice comparison in a moment between Iray and Filament so that we can adjust our options. So just like before, let's go and create another Filament Draw Options node that we'll leave here. There it is. And with it selected, I'm going to go over here to Window and change my viewports to side by side. And that'll help me display one Jolina in Iray and the other one in Filament. So maybe we'll have Iray on the right and Filament on the left here. And let's look at the camera in both. And I'll go and maybe just close this whole tab down because we don't need to see that. We're on the Filament Draw Options node in the Parameters tab. I should have access to that. So what we can now do is literally, since we're only using the environment light, let's go and match the intensity scale so that we get the same result on both in Filament and in Iray. So Iray we're not going to touch, we're just, this is what it looks like. But on here, with the environment intensity scale, let me just go and drop that down. Perhaps I'm going to try 2000, like it worked so well in the exterior. Nah, it's a bit low. Let's try 4000. That's kind of a good approximation. So that's how you can figure out what value for the environment lights you need. Just put your scene in different viewports and you look at them side by side and you think, yeah, okay, that's I can kind of live with that. If you're saying, okay, the right-hand side of the character is now more or less as illuminated as in Iray, but the left-hand side is still a little bit dark, you can go ahead and use the tone mapping to crank that up. So now with tone mapping, if I go and increase that, I can see that my filament viewport on the left here gets a little bit less dark. So if you wanted to increase that to, I don't know, is 2 maybe a bit much? Maybe it is a bit much, isn't it? Let's go and turn that to maybe, I don't know, 1.5. Kind of a felt value, whatever you're happy with. You can just go and tweak. Once you're happy with the filament viewport, you can go switch Iray off and then kind of keep working with filament. I think that's what that's meant for. So this applies if you're working with one HDRI and nothing else, but it's probably going to be more difficult if you're working with other lights. So let's make that happen. Let's go bring back our scene here. Let's switch my environment light off, in fact. So that is either under render settings, under environment, and just go drop down the intensity to 0. That'll now show us a black picture because we're not having any light sources right now, which is kind of cool. And let me go put this back to no, actually, let me go back to single viewport actually, and then we'll set our lights up. Viewports, single, and this I'm going to go switch over to texture shaded just so that I have a little bit of an illumination going on here. I'll go into my perspective view and give her maybe something like a side light from here. Notice, bad news, I'm afraid, that Filament does not currently support mesh lights. So it is literally all the lights that we see up here, distant light, spotlight, point lights. Those are supported, but no mesh lights right now. I'll go use a spotlight and copy all of this. And now I'll go and look through my spotlight and perhaps even go and switch this back to filament so that I can see what effect my light source has. So on my parameters tab then, under light, I can go and set up some photometrics for that. Usually the defaults are really not big enough, so I can just about see an effect if I go really close to my object. That is what the light does, but I'll probably want to be a little bit further away, so for that to make an effect I'm going to have to crank this up from 1500 luminous flux lumen to, I don't know, maybe 50,000. That's not even enough. Let's try 100,000. And that's also not quite, oh, there we go. Just need to go a little bit closer. So yeah, maybe 20,000 should suffice for this test. So this is what this looks like. Actually, let's go put this back to 50,000. There, way blown out in Filament. But if we were to go and switch this to Iray in a moment, we'll see that we'll probably need to make some adjustments here. So let's leave this as one light source. Let's go back to our 2 viewport configuration. And in Iray, actually, this looks pretty good. But in Filament on the camera, I can tell that this is way too much. So once again, then, with the filament draw option selected, let's head over to, this time, can whittle this down here under scale. There's these things here. This is scene light scale. That from 5 can be dropped down to, oh, that's nicely done. Sometimes defaults really don't work well. So if that makes such a big difference, I'm inclined to change the slider. The way the slider behaves is this behaves a little bit too fast for you. Even though we can probably agree that maybe 1 is a good approximation here. If you want this slider to react slightly less intense and erratic while I'm moving that. I get huge number changes here. If you wanted to change that, you could click on this little gear icon. As I said, early days, head over to parameter settings, and then in parameter settings, you can first of all set yourself a new default value, but you can also say what the nudge value is. So perhaps 0.1 instead of 1 might make more sense here. So now I probably have a better way of adjusting this in smaller increments here. But yeah, I suppose 1 is kind of a good approximation. And without that filament draw options node, you wouldn't be able to make these adjustments. So there we go. That's kind of nice to know that we now have that we can now see that the filament preview behaves more or less the same as what the Iray viewport looks like, but it reacts immediately. So it's, if you have a heavier scene that has more than one character in that, you need to just make that little adjustment there. It is, of course, there in addition to the environment intensity scale that we've just tweaked. Let's perhaps also look at the distance light. Perhaps I'm going to go and give my girl a distance light from the right. Let me change that back again to single and head over to my viewport again and give the distance light from here. I'm thinking distance lights, I don't know if you use them a lot. They give very harsh shadows. I'm not a big fan of them, but if we go and create one, it'll come into the middle of our scene, and it doesn't have a location, so it doesn't really matter where you put it. I'm just doing this for my own benefit, that I'm going to put this here. It doesn't matter how high or low you set this in the scene. I'll just do this to about here. So I want the light to come from the right, and perhaps a little bit from like that, to emulate kind of an afternoon sunlight, something like that. And once again, in the filament preview, it's super blown out, but of course the moment we switch this back over and see this side by side with our Iray viewport, we see that the default settings for my distant light aren't really enough to brighten up the right hand side there. So let's make that tweak so that Iray looks good, and then we go and tweak the filament viewport so that we know that looks okay as well. So in Iray then, with the distant light selected, on parameters under light, the luminous flux, I suppose, could be cranked up to let's say 20,000. That gives us a little bit of a brighter thing here. We can try 50, but look at how filament looks. It looks terrible. Right, now let's do this. Maybe that's a bit too much. Maybe go for the middle, 25,000. So we have a little bit of a shadow there still, but it's also brightened up a little bit. So that's the distance light setup, so that I'm kind of happy with the value. But of course, filament really needs an adjustment. And that is now set with the distance scene light scale up here. So 50 is just way too much. Let's go crank that down and see. Oh yeah, we've got the same issue with the slider. So the value of 1 really isn't good, because it's almost like on and off. Too much or off, that's the only thing we can do here. So I'm going to do the same as what I did before here under parameter settings. Personal preference, I think the nudge value, because it reacts just ever so slightly too much, I think 0.1 is a good starting value. Also the default value, I think 50 is it's a little bit overkill. Let's try 5, shall we? Reset that with 5, and 5 is still too much, but you can then go and make smaller adjustments this way until it matches your Iray viewport. And would you look at that? So 1 is too much still, so we can go and try like 0.5. I can still see that the effect is much bigger on the right here than it is in Iray, so I might have to go and put this down to 0.2 or something, 0.3 perhaps. Yeah, there you go. So 0.3 is probably a good starting value. So if you're interested in starting with these values, environment intensity 4000, scene lights scale 1 and distant light scale 0.3. I suppose it depends on the scene that you're using. Oh, also then the other thing is under tone mapping, 0.5 is probably a good starting point. But again, this could very much depend on the scene you're using. Your mileage may very much vary, but this is something that kind of works for me as a good starting point. And then you can go and build your scene and whiz around the viewport much faster than before. And if you wanted to render with Filament as an option, you head over to render settings, and under Engine, you switch from Iray to Viewport, and that'll then render your scene out as an actual Filament PBR preview. Two more things before I let you get on with your day to round up our grand tour of Filament integration, current integration into DAZ Studio, is just so that you know where to find them. With the Filament Draw options selected, there's this thing at the top here under Optimization, and that is something called Generate Texture Mipmaps. If you don't know what that is, you're totally forgiven. Those are intermediate maps that you can or cannot use if you like. It makes rendering more efficient. I believe Wikipedia has a good article on this, and they show you how this works. So the idea is that with no MIP mapping, you would use the original maps provided, and that can lead to a moire kind of pattern. I don't think you can see that greatly here. No, I don't think you can on the video, but with MIP mapping, the maps are kind of rejigged, and that leads to render efficiency and smoother results if your objects are further away from the screen. So there is another thing here, I think, in the same article. If you scroll down, this is it. This is how Mipmaps actually, what they look like. They split the RGB channel, and then they make the RGB mini square smaller and smaller, and that, you know, apparently leads to better results. So I'll leave a link to this article in the description of this video if you want to know more about it, but just know that this is there. And if we go to our perspective view here quickly, it's barely visible. Let me go to the single viewport here. If my character is further away, you'll probably be able to see seams on her head and on her body, and that is a result of the mipmap calculation as the character goes further away. So as I zoom in, those seams seem to go away, but if you're further away, you might see these. So if that bothers you, try switching that off, because that'll use the original maps without any rejigging, and then the seams are gone. It doesn't seem to have an effect on close-up render, so if you zoom in really closely, I can still see the same skin detail without mipmaps that I can't see with mipmaps. But, you know, just know that there's a rejigging process, and we are able to switch that off. While I'm talking about switching things on and off, there is another thing under which you can find some of the filament options, and that is under Draw Settings. That's a tab that is specific to the viewport shading you're using. So currently we have things on here that are specific to the draw style of Filament, but of course if you change the draw style to something else, then the options will change. So that's where to find other values, such as environment options as well as optimization options. So there's this thing as well, Generate Mipmap. So they follow whatever is set in other places of DAZ Studio. So this is not in addition to that. Just in case you stumble upon this, you can find some of these things there as well. Just wanted you to know that, because, you know, it is all difficult stuff. That is all I know for now. It is early days, so I'm sure we're going to see some changes there. Mesh lights, as I said, are not supported yet. Transparency is, you know, could be better, but I suppose for building scenes in something that gives us a much better preview than OpenGL ever has, or the current implementation of OpenGL, the texture shaded viewport, that's what I mean, I think is a good improvement in DAZ Studio. It's available in the latest beta 4.14 of DAZ Studio. Grab it now from the DAZ store. I'll leave a link to that product in there. You have to buy it, it's a free product, but you have to buy it so that you have access to it. I'll put a link in the description there so you can go and install it, fiddle around with it, and play around, have fun with Filament PBR. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you also so much to my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, and everyone else who supports me via Twitch subscriptions or Amazon merchandise or anything else that you guys do. You rock. Thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate that. I will see you next time with more schnick schnack and shenanigans. Take care.